The headlines are fast, furious, and alarming. Suicide rates among African Americans have risen dramatically. Black youth are 2 times more likely to die by suicide compared to their white counterparts. 30-year-old former Miss America attorney and TV host Chesley Christ dies from apparent suicide. Ian King, son of award-winning actress Regina King, dead at 26 by suicide. Kevin Ward, mayor of Hattsville, Maryland, dead by suicide. Why are Black teens and young adults killing themselves at such alarming rates? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
According to experts, rarely is there one single thing that drives someone to attempt suicide. And likewise, there are many factors, from bullying to financial issues, childhood trauma, racism, COVID isolation, and even social stigma. The shocking suicide headlines have experts and elected officials scrambling to find answers and provide interventions. One thing is clear. This is an issue that demands an urgent and comprehensive response and all hands on deck, because literally our babies are dying before our very eyes. Here for my leadoff discussion this morning is New Jersey Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. She is the sponsor of the Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act, legislation to address the disparities in access, care, and study of mental health issues among people of color. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, Congresswoman Watson Coleman.
Thank you for having me. Sorry we have to have this discussion, but thank you for having me, giving me an opportunity to just share some of my concerns.
Yeah, I agree with you, Congresswoman. I respect so much the work that you've been doing. Unfortunately, this is a conversation we don't have enough in the African American community, so it's really my honor to have you here to talk about what is happening amongst Black teens and emerging adults. These headlines are shocking, they're startling, but they're not new. The research shows that the suicide rates amongst African American teens and young adults has been on the rise for over a decade. But why did it take some of these headlines involving Regina King's son and now, the former, Miss America, Miss Christ, for us to start to really shine a bright spotlight on mental health in the Black community?
So I think you're talking about mainstream media there, because folks like us have been concerned about those issues for quite a while. We tried to tackle some of those issues with an emergency task force in Congress, where Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble was a very instrumental part of our working group. We know that the research that was being done wasn't being done in disaggregating who was more threatened, who was more susceptible. Looked like even the issue of suicide among young people was either going down or stable, except that when you did a deep dive and you looked at what was happening in the Black community, it was entirely different. It was rising. It was rising with the very young. It's rising with those who are not just the very young, but the older ones like you're talking about. And it's so many reasons, and you mentioned a number of them, but fundamentally it's racism. Because of racism, you don't have the resources that are necessary in our communities to the extent that they should be there so that our communities can be healthy. You don't have the counselors, the culturally competent counselors and psychologists and sociologists and things like that. You have discrimination in the school districts where teachers and administrators are interpreting traumatic behaviors on the part of our children as something, as bad behavior, as opposed to the trauma that they're experiencing. So you've got people who are missing the signals. Now, I can't speak for the three sort of celebrity types that you mentioned. That's very tragic as well, and also shows you that money and fame and whatnot is not the answer to happiness. But we need to know, what were they saying? What were they doing? What were they manifesting? As a Black community, we have a tendency to say, oh, you're having a bad day, pray on it. You're having a bad day, just think of something happy that happened. Aren't you blessed that you're here, kind of thing? Look at your glass half full. It's not that simple. And we need to be investing in serious research and clinical trials and educating and encouraging more women and minorities, particularly Black, to get into these fields, because our communities seriously have a lack of access and seriously need more. And so for me, as a legislator and appropriator, I need to continue to fight for more resources, for the NIH and other research institutes to use more Black researchers and investigators and value the work that they do and the decisions that they've reached based upon their informed engagements.
Yeah. I know, Congresswoman, you've been at this work for a long time, and I thank you for using your voice and your platform to make others in Congress, in the government, aware of the lack of resources and the lack of access that we see regularly in the Black community. But have you noticed over time, you mentioned how we in the Black community oftentimes minimize mental health issues. We tell people to go pray. We say that, you should be grateful for what you have. Don't focus on what you don't have. So we hear that oftentimes, and it's repeated to our kids, it's repeated to adults. But have you seen any change over the last, say, even decade, where we as a community are starting to have these more serious and focused conversations about mental health? Are you noticing any change?
Slowly. There was always a stigma associated with having a mental challenge in our community. And it was always, from my perspective as a layperson, don't let me get in Dr. Breland-Noble's lane here, but as a layperson, those individuals who were manifesting some sort of emotional and mental issues, they were considered people with weaknesses, not illnesses. And I believe that these are illnesses. And while I think that there is a greater degree of education, association, and appreciation of the issue, it's not enough. Right. I mean, if you're in a large city, you might have a lot of counselors and scholars and folks like that who are sharing the word. But if you live in other areas, no, not so much. And if you're really connected to your church, unless it's kind of a progressive church, right, you're not getting that kind of counseling and recommendations and encouragement to go seek mental health help.
Congresswoman, you've mentioned Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble a couple of times. I want to bring her into the conversation. She's a good friend of the show. She's the author of the Handbook of Mental Health in African American Youth. She's been outspoken on this issue of mental health in the Black community, specifically around our teens. Good morning, Dr. Alfiee. So glad to have you here. I know that you've worked closely with Congresswoman Watson Coleman. You've testified before Congress on these issues. Help us understand, these issues aren't new, but are we looking at them in a different way today than perhaps we were 5 or even 10 years ago?
I think we are, in part because of the Congresswoman. I always give her props, always, for being one of the first people in my lifetime. I've been at this for over 22 years, probably 25 years at this point, to really say all of the things that she shared, which is that these issues have been in our community for decades, right? For centuries. Think about the history of slavery. And, I've heard Dr. Joy Degree say there was no comprehensive mental health plan for Black people at the end of slavery, bringing us all the way up to today. So when have we had the opportunity to heal those traumas? And so what I would say is these issues have always been here, but there's this problem. And the problem is that in our field of research, there is a standard, and it's a monochromatic standard that does not account for the beauty and the rich diversity of all of us. So if you're not accounting for fully who we are as Black people and all of our diversity and all of our glory, then you can't begin to address the issues that are plaguing and impacting our communities. And I'm not talking about the ones that everybody goes to. Everybody wants to go to poverty and violence. Yes, those are a part, but that's not all of what our experience is as Black people. So if we don't deal with racism, if we don't deal with discrimination, if we don't deal with these disparities across socioeconomics, across healthcare, across all these other social areas, then we can't begin to address the needs of our Black children because we're not dealing with the levers that need to be pushed to get our kids the help that they need. And so we end up with these grave disparities because the idea is, oh, well, we know how to address suicide prevention. Actually, we don't. In this group. So of course, let's just change it a little bit and adjust it for all these other groups. And that's not the reality. And that's not what's going to help. So to the Congresswoman's credit, she and the CBC got on board and said, look, you need to listen to these experts who've been doing this work, understand what they're saying, fund them. That's the thing I've been most outspoken about. And so that they can build the tools and work with Black communities to get our young people the help that they need.
And Dr. Alfiee, you mentioned just a range of things that cause people to have mental health, obviously racism being at the core of what you talked about. But do those issues hit young people differently? Because it seems like I talk to so many of my friends who have high school age kids and college age kids, and something about that age, when they get into the later years in high school or the beginning years of college, their kids start to manifest these mental health challenges. And so is there something unique that happens to kids at late teen, early adulthood that we need to be aware of?
Absolutely. So some of it is just the trajectory of when mental health concerns begin to emerge across the board, regardless of age. The challenge is I think that we have not done a good job in the mental health field of really trying to understand how might that look different across different racial ethnic groups. So we just assume, right? And so things like your first psychotic break, when the first time the person has a break with reality, that tends to happen in college age years, right? That's just kind of across the board, but we don't really know if that's different for Black children because we haven't studied it. I think issues like depression, anxiety, and some of those things, you are going to start to see those things emerge as early as middle school, and in some cases, little children. But I think there's something about this combustible combination of development, the teen years where you're rapidly developing, you have puberty, you have all these issues around you want to fit in, layered with issues of identity, right? So I always say it's not that the kids have issues with their own identity, it's how other people engage with them. So you put all those things together and you do have challenges. The final thing I will say is that we often don't give our young people, we have not taught them the coping skills that they need around mental health. And so how do they cope with all of these things? That's when we start to see these unaddressed, untreated mental health concerns really kind of explode and show up in many different ways for our young people.
Yeah. Dr. Alfiee, you've mentioned this issue of not having the resources in the Black community to study what happens specifically around Black kids. And I know, Congresswoman, that's a concern of yours. And you've actually introduced a bill, the Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act. Tell us what that act will do to address these issues of disparities.
Well, it would ensure that there are greater resources that are available to study these issues, and there was an expectation and a provision that would ensure that there were more people like Dr. Alfiee who are doing the actual research or doing the actual investigation, but are also reviewing the applications. So to make sure that there was a diversity in the applications before these institutes to be acknowledged and to be supported. But I wanted to add on just one thing from a lay perspective that Dr. Alfiee was talking about. One of the reasons I got involved in that whole issue was because I kept looking at Facebook and there were children that were 5, 9, 7, 11, and they were attempting or they were succeeding in suicide. And I just couldn't wrap my brain around how someone of that age could think that that's a solution to a problem. Right. And so you asked about when do our kids sort of, kind of get exposed to something that carries them. And I think they get exposed to it at a very, very, very young age. I mean, I remember going to a predominantly white school when I was in elementary school, and I was a pretty fair-skinned individual. They knew. And so when we played games, they wanted me to be the maid, So there was all, from very young ages, I don't know how they pick it up, but from very young ages, children who are not minorities have a certain feeling about minority children that's not based on anything other than the fact that they don't look like them.
Wow. I assume,
And
Dr. Alfiee,
that
that learning
impacts
that,
our children. Mhm.
I just want to ask Dr. Alfiee, I assume that learned behavior that the Congresswoman just described happens because they're seeing something at home or they're hearing something at home from their parents?
100%. And that we have this thing in our community, in the Black community specifically, that's been studied quite well called racial socialization, right? And for Black people, racial socialization, or this idea of how do you teach a young Black person what it means to be Black in our society, right? It's an outgrowth of the work of how we grow up here in the US. Of course, it has applicability to all parts of the diaspora, but it's particularly relevant here because of exactly what you said, Areva, this idea of when you show up at school, where would a kid get the idea that the brown girl is supposed to be the maid? Why she can't be the lady of the house, right? Why can't she be the president? It's because of what they hear and what they see. And if we don't provide the correct types of racial socialization for our children, even for white kids, then we end up with these situations where they sometimes inadvertently, because when they're little, they don't necessarily know that's a bad thing, right? Inadvertently or intentionally build a wall, right? Remember all that rhetoric, hurt children of color. And so we have to, work overtime as Black parents, right? I have 2 teenagers, to teach our young people, you are valuable just as you are. Don't allow what these people say to hurt you. But that's the constant thing that we have to do at earlier and earlier ages for our children.
Yeah.
Can I say that in my young experience, I was just talking to you about, I remember going home and telling my mother, she was asking me about how do you play in the playground. And I told her, and she said, you go back and tell them that you're going to be the lady of the house and you let one of them be the maid. So I understood that, but she didn't build upon that.
Right.
Yeah. She didn't build upon that, Bonnie. This is why they do that or did it.
Yes.
It was as I got older and my parents kind of contextualized my experiences, which actually kind of emboldened me. And at one point I had such a terrible chip on my shoulder. My dad was worried about me, but I'm kind of like, I'm okay. I'm better now.
Okay. Well, tell us where this bill is, Congresswoman. What's the status of it?
The bill passed in the last Congress. Now we had to reintroduce it in this Congress, and we hope that the Senate picks it up because I believe that we have some Senate sponsors now, but the dysfunction of the Senate. So, and then we just had a recent illness of a member of the Senate. So things may get delayed even more, but it'll be repassed again in the House. And pieces.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Is it bipartisan? Yes. I think I have a few members of the other conference on the bill in the House. And why not?
What can we do to support you, the work that you're doing, and this bill? Because it seems like exactly what we need. It's going to drive more resources to address the disparities in mental health.
First of all, that bill is just scratching the surface and we got a lot more to do. And I want us to know that. And I want everyone else to know that we're going to continue to work on it. But amplifying is so vitally important. They need to hear it from every corner, from every part of the country, and from multiple communities and organizations, that there's a recognition that there's not enough resources in this space, that we need access to more education and supportive education for higher education for people of color to get into these areas, and that we need all kinds of other research and resources in our communities to ensure that people can see the signs, people can mitigate some of the, devaluing that a person has that says it's not worth my living any longer. There's so much work to be done, and there's just such a gap between our need and our resources, particularly in our community. And our community is even more challenged than, let's say, the Hispanic community. And I do believe in the bottom of my heart that fundamentally at the core of all this is racism and its manifestation in all systems.
Yes.
Well,
And if I could just add
a conversation about structural racism. Go ahead, Dr. Alfiee.
Yes, what I would just add to the Congresswoman's comments is that if people would go download the Ring the Alarm report from her congressional website, they can see what we need. They can see the specific things that we want amplified. And for me, that's even like the Twitter warriors, right? The social media warriors. put it out there that we care about research funding going to build up these kinds of institutions and to build up the knowledge that we already have in our communities. If we can get people to be real concrete and specific by downloading that report and amplifying those specific ideas, that can go a real long way.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Alfiee. We will definitely share that link on all of our social sites and ensure that we continue to amplify this message. I want to thank you so much, Congresswoman, for joining us this morning. Thank you so much for the work you're doing on this and continuing to be a voice. We're going to do everything we can do by encouraging our viewers to write to their Congress people, encourage them to get involved in this work, tell them how much this is needed in our community, how the resources are needed, and the voices of Black experts, researchers, and providers are so needed at this time in particular. So again, thank you, Congresswoman, for joining.
Thank you. God bless. Have a good day.
Dr. Alfiee, I want to keep you around for a little bit more because I want to bring on someone who, an author,
Yes.
a spoken word artist, and a blogger. Her name is Hannah Drake. She wrote this moving blog post about Cheslie Kryst that went viral. The piece is entitled Black Women, It Is Okay to Let Go of Your Cape. Good morning, Hannah, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I reached out to you on Instagram. I never met you, had never read anything you wrote, but I came across that blog and it just touched me in such a significant way because you raised so many issues about the struggles that Black women experience. And you were moved, obviously, by Cheslie's suicide. Tell us why you wrote the piece and what do you think is burdening Black women at this time?
When I read about her suicide, I immediately, of course, we all celebrated when she won. It was like all the Black women were winning awards and Miss America, Miss USA, and all the things. And we were so excited. So I clearly remembered exactly who she was. And I went immediately to her Instagram to just look at her pictures. I wanted to see if I could notice anything looking at her smiling. And typically when people are really excited, their eyes will light up. It will match their smile. And I was trying to see anything in her photos. And in all her photos, she's stunningly beautiful. No one could doubt that. And so a lot of people think because you're stunningly beautiful and you have this amazing job and you're traveling the world and you're wealthy, that this could not happen to you. Right. And so it just reminded me that Black women are carrying so much that Black women never really speak about because we're penalized if we speak about what's troubling us. So that's why I really wanted to write the blog, and over 60,000 women have read that. Wow. And have reached out to me. And it showed me that Black women are hurting and they're holding a lot on the inside. And it was like they just needed permission to say, I'm not okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And what touched me so much, Hannah, was you made the statement that Black girl magic has been distorted. And now there's this narrative that Black women are always supposed to be strong and resilient. And by taking on that role, that cape, that narrative now makes it more difficult for Black women to seek help when they are feeling depressed or empty or lonely. So I wanted to get your take on that, Dr. Alfiee, because we've gone through this period where Black girl magic is the thing we say, it's what we post on social media, it's how we interact with each other. But has the term taken on this extra burden now?
I think so. And I think part of it is this idea that that Black girl magic and what we see in socials and what we see presented outwardly, that we're all supposed to adhere to that standard all the time. So when we talk about a Cheslie Kryst, my God, my heart hurts for her family. I'm so sorry for their loss. I think what we miss is everything that goes into pushing her to those kinds of heights. That was hard work, right? And so people think, she has a law degree, you're an attorney, Areva, you know how hard it is to get through law school. So I think the idea that we forget as Black women, and she was a multiracial Black woman, there are challenges even when we're succeeding. I remember years ago, this whole thing around Sheryl Sandberg and Lean In. And all I kept thinking to myself was, if a sister goes in trying to lean in, you've talked about this in your book, Areva, we get penalized, right? And so, sometimes people don't understand.
Lean back.
Yes, honey, it's not the same for us, right? And so if a Black woman is passionate, she's angry, right? Well, what's wrong with being angry? It's an emotion, like we have a full range of emotions. We should have access to all of our emotions. And so the final thing I'll add is just this piece about even when we seek help. I've had multiple conversations with Black women specifically in the last month where they've tried to use some of these apps and the tech-based supports around mental health. They get in, when they want to start talking about race, those providers are not ready to have those conversations. And so that's a double penalty. You're going to get help, but you can't even get the help that you need because these providers are not equipped to have conversations with race about you. So where are you? You're back to being isolated. And I think this is a lot of the struggle that our sister speaks to in her spoken word and in her blog posts. It's pervasive. And now one other thing I just want to add, I remember a wave of Black women suicides that were unexpected going all the way back to 2013. There was a very popular blogger, young woman, she's probably in her 20s, who unexpectedly, right, suddenly died by suicide. And people are like, oh my God, what happened? But I think for a lot of Black women, we're sort of nodding our heads and saying, no, we wouldn't wish that on anybody, but we understand that weight, we understand that pain, and we understand the inability to ever put that stuff down. So you put your crown on, but sometimes that crown gets heavy. And you need to be able to take it off, put it down, and just relax. And we don't get those opportunities too often.
Yeah, I want to speak to what you said, Dr. Alfiee. You're so right. Chesley was not only a law student, she had a double degree, a JD MBA, which very few African-American women throughout this country have. And I think she was the first at her law school to obtain that degree. And she was, at 28, the first. She's the oldest woman to win that pageant. So when you think about what she had to go through to accomplish what she accomplished, we know what that journey is like. And Hannah, you talk yourself about having periods where you felt empty and you felt alone. Why did you want to share that? Why do you think that was important to share? Because in our community, we often don't want to talk openly about going through anything like that because on social, it's all smiles and perfect.
Right. I really wanted to share that because when people look at my life, they think, oh, Hannah's a writer and she's on social media and she has a lot of followers and everything's wonderful. And it appeared that way online. Yeah. And it took some of my friends and my daughter to say, Mom, something is wrong with you. You're not okay. And you need to go get some help. And they sent me away for a week just to do nothing. And it was a weird thought. What do you mean I can be here and do nothing? What does do nothing mean? I'm just supposed to sit here and relax. And that was such a foreign concept to me because Black women are always doing and fixing, and I have to be writing and I have to be speaking and I have to be doing the next thing. That just to sit for a week in nature and in silence meant so much to me that I had that time. And I want to add, I really want to get this out in writing that blog. And even though I wrote it, the thing that stood out to me the most that I wrote was Black joy, and Black women finding joy is an act of defiance because this world never intended on Black women or Black people, period, having any joy. Black people were brought here as property. That was never part of the agreement, that Black people were going to experience joy. And so the fact that you can find that is an act of defiance and is an act against white supremacy.
I'm glad you brought that up, Hannah, because we had an opportunity to interview on the special report a woman who's written a beautiful book called Black Joy. And she talks very powerfully about some of the same topics you just shared. Dr. Alfiee, I read an article from Chesley's mom that said her daughter led a double life, a public life that screamed success, that screamed happiness, beauty, and travel and excitement. But her mom said she had a private life where she was depressed, and she didn't even share that depression with her mom. How common is that someone lives this completely public, perfect life, but yet behind the scenes, they are suffering?
Yeah, so I think when we think about Black people, let's think about that poem from way back in the day. I think it was Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask. Black folk, we have to wear the mask, right? Because if we show up without the mask, we are penalized. And I think there's this idea, particularly for millennials and Gen Zers, a lot of their lives are on social media. So you're literally always needing to be on, right? I don't look like this. It took like 2 people to get this face to look like this. This is not how I look all the time. Do you know what I mean? And I'm comfortable with how I look without it. But I think for so many of us, we get so used to the curated versions of ourselves. We don't even know who the non-curated versions are, and we're celebrated for the curated versions, right? We're not celebrated for being authentic and real and just showing up plain without any makeup, not always showing up with natural hair. Like, I just think about all those kinds of things. And so I think the other piece of it for Black women in particular is there's this idea, just as our sister said with her blog, of you do have to be magical all the time. And so even for her to hear somebody say, no, you're allowed to rest. In fact, please go rest. Please go do nothing. That is just foreign to who we are. So yes, for a lot of people, they are hiding this from their loved ones and the people they care for, in part because when you have depression and when you comorbid with anxiety, because it's rarely ever by itself, the isolation, you want to isolate, right? And so how do you isolate? You make everybody think it's fine, or you find other ways to push them away. And I think for us as Black people in particular, we don't want to burden people, right? Especially our parents. Think about the stuff that our parents come home and say about their struggles every day. Like these people out here, like making me work twice as hard to get half as much. And you hear that so much, you don't want to then be an additional burden. So what do? Put on that mask, you're smiling, you look happy, and nobody's going to ask you, anything different because they don't even know how to scratch to see what's behind that smile.
So Dr. Alfiee, Hannah's family recognized that something was going on with her and they recommended that she take this week off. What are some of the signs that we should be looking for? And when do we know if we need something more than a vacation, when it rises to the level of needing professional help?
Yes. So what I always tell people, you have the general and you have the specific. The general is we always want to be aware of, you've heard me say this many times, Areva, what is your baseline? On when it's neutral, when everything is neutral, how does that feel for you? What does a 5 feel like for you on a scale of 1 to 10? If you notice over a period of time that you're dropping below that 5, and it lasts for a week or 2, that's when you need to start thinking, maybe I need some support. Maybe I need to get some help. What is that low, what is that dropping down below a 5 look like? You're either sleeping all the time or you're not sleeping enough. You can't get to sleep at night. Your eating habits change drastically. You isolate yourself. You have no patience for anybody, right? Every tiny little thing gets on your nerves, right? Somebody says hi to you and you're immediately fussing. Those are the signals that there's something that's not right. You feel agitated. You can't relax. You can't find peace. And so if you're feeling like that over a period of time, you know that it's time to get some support. But I think a lot of us don't take enough time to even understand what baseline is. Because right, think about Black women, like Sister Hannah said, you always going. So when do you figure out what baseline is? You never have time. So those are the things that I think, that I encourage women and all people to think about. Know your baseline, understand what that is, calibrate, and understand when you're out of whack, out of calibration. I think those are ways that we can help ourselves figure out when it's time to get support.
Yeah. Hannah, I'll just end with you. What do you want people to take away? 60,000 people, I hope 100,000 plus people read this blog because it's so powerful. What's the number one takeaway you want people to leave with?
What I want people to understand, especially Black women, is to reclaim you. And taking care of yourself is an act of defiance. Setting boundaries is an act of defiance. Having joy is an act of defiance. It is okay to put yourself first. You don't have to live your life on the back burner.
Yeah, I love you wrote in the piece that everybody expects Black women to secure the vote, fight for justice, teach diversity, basically save the nation.
Yeah.
And we can't do all of that and raise our kids and take care of our own mental health. And we don't have to do all of that, which is, I think, the most powerful point of your blog. Thank you so much for writing that and sharing it. Always a pleasure, my friend, Dr. Alfiee. Alfiee, I'm going to have you back. I need to talk to you. These issues are not going away. I want you just one last thing. Can you address for us just real quickly? I know you have some time. Constraints, prayer. Yes. We tell each other in our community, pray on it, help us understand how we should be centering prayer, important, but not a substitute for mental health care.
Exactly what you just said. Prayer is important, whatever your faith background is, but prayer is a tool in your toolkit, right? So so the same way that God gave you the ability to pray and to develop a relationship with her, she also put mental health professionals on this earth, and these people are trained. Some of them look like you. Go get some help from these people. They can help you. They want to help you. We are out here to support you. So they have to go together. We can't use one in the absence of the other. And therapy is not a replacement for your prayer life. If your prayer life is important to you, we want those things to work in consort, not separate.
I'm chuckling because you said you use the pronoun her, and I was just in a chat group with some of my friends from St. Louis, and someone had said, praise them. And I wrote back, I says, well, it's probably praise her.
That part.
And if we weren't in a patriarchal white male system, it would definitely be her. So let's start changing that.
And she brown. So don't forget that part, right? So and she brown. So that's what we're going to say. Yes.
We're always like that. That's why I love to have you on. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And hopefully we're going to get that funding from the bill that the Congresswoman is working on, because it is so incredibly needed in our community.
Thank you, Areva. Thank you so much.
Be well, my friend. All right, my next guest, her name is Dr. Rebecca Semel. She is a psychologist in the New York area. She also had some, I thought, insightful words on how we should be thinking about adolescents and emerging adults who are presenting with mental health issues. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Semel.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We know that Chesley, who we've been talking a lot about this morning, lived this public life. She had over 1 million followers on social media platforms. She often posted about that life. I know you were quoted in an article saying that it is common for people to portray a shiny, positive version of themselves online. How is social media driving what we're seeing in terms of mental health issues with respect to young people in particular?
Well, I also want to say, Dr. Alfiee said before, the way that you present online and your social media presence, it does get reinforced when you look good, when things are positive, when you're showing that sort of shiny exterior. And it's much harder to share that vulnerable side like Hannah shared. It's not easy to put yourself out there and show those struggles, and it doesn't get reinforced in the same way. So I think that what we're seeing with young people is they want to present this facade because that's what gets more likes. You're not going to get as many likes if you're putting up, maybe your selfie in the morning without makeup, or that you're having a hard time. You're not getting the likes, you're not getting the engagement. And so for them, it's so important to present this, this facade of that everything's okay, that I always have it together, because that's what they also think people want them to be and want them to look like. So it's interesting how people have that public social media persona, and then the private life could be completely different, but that's just not what they're sharing.
You used a phrase, or you were quoted using the phrase parasocial relationships. What are those?
So that's when you have a relationship with someone on social media, but it's sort of one-sided, right? So when we, follow a celebrity who we're really interested in, we're a big fan of, we see these glimpses of their life. And so we think that we know them. We think that we know everything about them. And so like what happened with Chesley is people were saying, she looked so happy, something nefarious must have happened. How could someone who is so happy and doing so well, die by suicide? And people had a hard time believing it, because I think they want to preserve the idea of who they think they know online. And, you think that you know someone, you think that because you're seeing their life, but you're only seeing the part that they're presenting. So it's this sort of one-sided relationship that's also only showing one facet of who this person is. It's not showing the holistic person behind the screen or behind the, the Twitter or the Instagram.
How do you suggest that people who may go to social media see these perfect images of celebrities or people that they respect and look up to, and get upset themselves or start to feel less than themselves? How do they have the appropriate approach to social media? Because it's everywhere. You can't just check out of it. It's, LinkedIn. There's so many social media sites that are tied to your job, to your career.
Yeah.
But how do you have a healthy relationship on social media?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's also not only with celebrities. I mean, the teens, the emerging adults, the sort of Gen Z people that I work with all the time are constantly having emotional reactions to something they've seen on social media, because it makes them feel not enough. Or, that feeling like when we were in high school, you got to school on Monday morning and there might've been a party that you missed. And yeah, that sucks. That's a bad feeling to feel excluded. They're seeing it in real time. Yeah. They're seeing people excluding them in real time, or they're seeing the fun things people did over the weekend, or they're seeing, some of my younger clients will see, a 20-year-old influencer who's seemingly has this perfect life, making all this money, and they, are still in college too. And how is that person doing that? So what I often tell people is just really limit your use. So when you find yourself like on that sort of black hole of just scrolling through, put those screen time limits on, limit that use, put the phone down at some point. And I also really encourage people just to remind themselves, this is what someone is choosing to put out there. And it's a lot of self-talk. You have to sort of convince yourself to believe this stuff, but it's true. We know that people are only putting out there what they want the world to see. So you really have to remind yourself, that's not that whole person. The same way I'm not putting everything online. And so it's sort of the combination of limiting screen time and remembering that these are real people with holistic lives, and what they're showing is what they're choosing to show and not the full picture.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear that this isn't just happening with young people.
Right.
myself will look online. I was chuckling during the holidays. I was looking at friends who were having parties that I wasn't invited to. And I told my husband, I said, oh, so-and-so had a party. They didn't invite me. I got invited to that party last year. And it made me think about, now as an adult, I was perfectly fine. It's COVID. I wasn't going to the party anyhow. But I thought about my children and what it must be like to be a teenager, as you said, not just find out on Monday that there was a party, but to actually be at home watching your friends go live on their Instagram page, on their Facebook page, showing all the festivities at this event, and you're at home, you didn't get invited, and how that can cause you to feel like the other, right? You're the other person, you're the outsider. So it can be damaging both to kids and adults. I want to move on though and ask you about COVID. Can't talk about these increasing mental health issues without talking about the impact of the pandemic. So how are we to just make sense of what's happening? We're going into year 3 now, but so much isolation, school closures, lockdowns, and people are feeling the impact of it.
Yeah, it's really challenging with COVID. I think that for young people, especially, for everyone, we know this too, but for young people, they have lost out on almost 3 years of socializing, of learning how to be people in this society, of having to, problem solve in person with people, and so many of our young people who are at home doing online school or this hybrid or going back and forth as soon as somebody has a COVID case, I get it, of course, but then all they're doing is sitting by themselves in a room on a screen, logging on and off to go to school. And so much of school is the interpersonal part and sitting in the lunchroom with people or helping someone, do their homework, but in person. And so that lack of socialization, I'm seeing it with a lot of my clients feel so much younger. I have a couple 16-year-olds I work with who I can't believe they're going to be applying to college next year because they feel sort of like they're 14 because they missed those 2 years of socializing and of that, maturing in person that school affords you. But, for everybody across the board, all ages, this isolation is really challenging. And I think I don't think we knew how important it was to walk into an office and just say hi to someone. Even if that's all you did all day and you sat in your cubicle, you still said hi to your admin person when you walked in, or you saw somebody when you were making coffee. And we, I think, took for granted those small interactions. And now we have to find them ourselves and make them ourselves, by calling a friend or something when you have free time. But it's not the same reward as maybe being in person.
What recommendations do you have for anyone that may be feeling that sense of isolation because they aren't able to have those water cooler conversations, those lunches that you often have, the company events that present opportunities for people to network and to feel like a part of a family? What advice do you have for folks to try to get some of that back?
Yeah, well, ironically, one thing would be to connect with people on social media. So it sort of goes against, right, the limiting of screen time. But for a lot of people, I recommend finding, Facebook groups that are really active or something. If you really like classic films or something, you can find a group on Facebook, or specific types of industries have different groups and things like that. So I really encourage people to get onto different message boards, Facebook groups, things like that. And then as much as you can, try and connect with people. Again, it's over the screen, but really making that time to FaceTime people. I joke with some of my friends, like being an adult and having friendships means scheduling time to call each other and find that time in your day. But it is really important because we have to feel connected. It is not normal as humans to go through life isolated. We need a group of people. And so you have to find moments of connection and really push yourself to find that time in this COVID world that we're in.
Doctor, we had some viewers that wrote in some questions. I want to ask you a couple of them. One is, how can a loved one who is a trigger for a person who may be bipolar or have some other mental health issues help that person, help their loved one without making it worse or being the subject themselves of abuse from that person when they're going through a mental health crisis?
That's a really hard question to answer. I think, it's really all about boundaries. And I think if you are the loved one supporting someone who's going through a mental health crisis, you also have to recognize your own boundaries in that. And, someone might be having a crisis and might be taking that out on you. You might be the target of abuse or, any type of harmful language from this person. And it's okay to put a boundary up. that's not being unsupportive. You can find other ways to support, like connecting them to mental health resources, making sure that they are going to therapy, making sure that they are talking to a clinician, to a psychiatrist, sort of getting connected with those resources. And it's still okay to put that boundary up because you have to protect yourself and your own peace. And part of that is supporting that person, but not at the cost of your own mental health.
And what about one of the other questions has to do with trying to get help for that individual? If that person is refusing to go into treatment or to take medication that's been prescribed, is there any way that you can gently nudge that person into treatment?
It's very hard to have someone go into treatment who doesn't want to be there. That is one of the largest barriers to treatment that we have. Access, of course, like you spoke about with the Congresswoman and with Dr. Alfiee, but another barrier is that people don't want to get help. It's really hard. People think that it's going to be something that it's not, and they expect a bad experience. So, all you can do is really encourage someone that this is, we want to support you. This is to help you to be your best self. Like Hannah said, her family saw her struggling and encouraged her to take this space and take a break. But, at the end of the day, you can't really compel someone to go to treatment. They have to want it. And so you can talk about it from an I perspective. So, when I see you hurting, it hurts me. When I see you having a hard time going to your therapist, it makes me upset for you. How can I help you? And so you can talk about it from an I perspective. And sometimes that's a nice way in to help someone.
All right. Another viewer asked about when should you call 911 or one of the intervention hotlines to have professionals come in and intervene, maybe take the person to a hospital?
So if someone is threatening themselves or others, then you absolutely should call 911 or call an intervention service of some type. And if someone is really having a psychotic episode where you can tell that they are not tethered to reality. And so what I mean by that is maybe they're having delusions, they're hallucinating, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there that you're not hearing. That's a time that you can absolutely call 911. Not most. Some cities are now sending social workers along with 911 responders, which is really, really great. And we want more of that, trained mental health professionals who are going out to these calls. But so one thing to consider is that, who's coming when you call 911 might not be, there might not be a mental health professional right there. So it might be better to call something like a hotline. But if someone is really in a state where they are going to harm themselves or harm someone else, it's absolutely the right time to call 911.
Yeah, and just lastly, Dr. Semel, Chesley's mom spoke out about her daughter's depression and her suicide. And she said, even though she was her closest friend, she wasn't aware what her daughter was going through. Are there warning signs that family members can look for an individual that may be going through something as difficult as depression that could ultimately lead to suicide? I know Dr. Alfiee talked about finding your baseline and then knowing when you're feeling, below that baseline. Do you have any other suggestions or tips that people should know that can help them identify warning signs?
Yeah, I loved what Dr. Alfiee said about baseline. What I also tell the people that I work with is if something is impacting your day-to-day functioning over, a couple weeks of time. And so like Dr. Alfiee said, if it's sleep, if it's eating, if you're just deeply unhappy for a couple weeks, that's absolutely time you can get help. And so as a family member or as a loved one, a coworker, even a support system to someone, if you see someone who is withdrawing, whose behaviors are changing, who they don't feel like themselves when you're talking to them, it's okay to ask them how they're doing, and just check in. And it might not be something so serious that they need help, professional help, but it's absolutely okay to check in. If someone is, if their behavior is changing in your eyes and you know them well and you're used to how they are, then that's probably a good sign that something's going on. It might just be a bad day, but it might be that they've had something going on for a couple of weeks and just didn't know how to ask for help or to tell somebody that they weren't doing okay.
We talked about resources, and we know there's disparities when it comes to resources, and certain communities have fewer than others. What's your take on a lot of the teletherapy options that are available? We heard Dr. Alfiee say that some of the apps get an F when it comes to dealing with the issue of race and mental health, but are there some online services or other kinds of mental health help that's out there, particularly for people who may not have health insurance, because everybody doesn't have health insurance. They may not have health insurance that allows them to go to a mental health professional. So what's available now? I know we are doing a lot with technology.
Hmm. Yeah, the online therapy platforms, I think that they are good in terms of accessibility, right? Getting in the door, getting the app. But like Dr. Alfiee said, everybody has different training who's going to be who's a clinician on those sites. And so what she was speaking to is that maybe there aren't as many culturally competent clinicians who have done their own training on race, racial identity, their own reflection on their racial identity. That's all going to become a barrier then when trying to support somebody who brings up race. So in terms of the online platforms, I think it's a good way to get in the door. There's like text support. You can sort of do live texting. So that's maybe good in a pinch, but ideally you are seeing somebody for talk therapy. And so in terms of resources, most cities have low fee psychology services, therapy services. A great resource is psychologytoday.com. And so that, you can type in your zip code, you can type in your insurance, you can type in what you're looking for in terms of a practitioner, whether that's race, gender, age. If you might feel more comfortable talking to someone who looks like you can actually filter for that on that website. So that's a great resource to find someone in your community. And then most therapists will also offer sliding scale fee options. So even if you don't have insurance or don't have out-of-network benefits, you can often talk to somebody and just share your, what's happening in your life, your income, what you're comfortable paying. And most therapists will offer some type of sliding scale fee so that therapy works for you. We're in this field to help people. And so we want to make that as accessible as possible.
So you said psychology.com.
Psychologytoday.com.
You can find therapists wherever you are in the country. Look for folks that you may feel the most comfortable with. You can filter, you said age, gender, other filters available on that site. And thank you for, saying that psychologists are in this business to help people get better, and that there are sliding scale options and other options that make mental health care more affordable and more accessible to people, even if they don't have health insurance or access to lots of resources. But thank you so much, Dr. Semel, for sharing your insights and this information. Obviously, we've got to talk so much more about issues of mental health in all communities, but particularly in communities of color. And I appreciate the work that you're doing in this area. And thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much.
All right, I want to thank all of my guests this morning for joining me. This is such a difficult topic. My heart just breaks for those family members, whether they're celebrities or not a celebrity, on social media, not on social media, anyone that loses a loved one to suicide. It's just an unimaginable pain. I know it because I've been with family members who have lost their loved ones to suicide. And some family members or some people that I know have never recovered from it. So it's a real issue, and we have to start talking about it and recognizing that it's a real issue, and recognizing that there are resources available. So as difficult as this show is to do and to talk about these issues, it's imperative. And all of us have a voice. All of us have to find ways to lift our voice on this issue, whether it's hosting a support group in your own home or your own community, volunteering at a mental health nonprofit organization, talking to your friends or your neighbors, sharing resources and information online. We all have a role to play. The statistics are just too startling for any of us to think we can take a back seat on this or that we can sit this one out. The need is there, it's urgent, and it's now. Just some words to live by before I get out. Silence is not always golden. Mental health challenges are widespread, and they're real in the Black community. And not talking about these issues won't change the dramatic increases in suicide that we have all witnessed over the last month, over the last decade, as Dr. Alfiee said. And as Hannah said, we are all fatigued. Fake news, partisan bickering over everything. Even over whether a woman that went to Harvard and got 2 degrees is qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. Yes, that's even becoming an issue. We're fighting about everything in this country, and it just seems like the chaos is never going to end. And I wish I could tell you that chaos has an expiration date or that I have a magic wand that I can just wave and magically make all of us understand that we have more in common than not. But I don't. I don't have a magic wand. I don't have any dates by which all this chaos is going to end. There is no magic bullet. But there is hope and there's help. There are Black and they're white and they're Asian and they're Latinx mental health professionals like the ones I had on the show this morning. There are elected officials like the Congresswoman that was here this morning, all who are working to make mental health care more accessible, more available, all who are working to end the stigma and to get help to those who are in the most need. There are websites, there's teletherapy, there's support groups, there's shows like this that are all ready to walk with you, stand with you, and heal with you. Together, yes, together, we can and will find help and healing for our young people, for our community. That I'm confident of. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster shot, and remember, we are all in this together.